Good evening. My name's Helen King and I'm the principal of St Anne's College, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to welcome you to this St Anne's online event. We're delighted that this evening, as well as many members of the college and alumni, we also have many members of the public who are here to hear our alumna Janina Ramirez speak to us on a fascinating topic. But because many of you may not know much about St Anne's, I just wanted to say a few words to introduce you to the college. The University of Oxford has 38 colleges, and St Anne's has a unique history amongst them. In 1979, the first colleges for women were founded alongside the Society of Home Students, which was the precursor body to St Anne's. The society was necessary because there were women who wanted to study at Oxford, but either because of their financial position or because of their domestic situation, they weren't able to join one of the new women's halls. That determination to enable the brightest students from all backgrounds to access an Oxford education has remained part of our history from the beginning right through to today, alongside a willingness to do things differently. Our first principal, Bertha Johnson, was the first woman to be awarded a degree by this university just over 100 years ago, in October 1920. We were the first part of the university to establish a nursery for children, and that nursery still looks after the children of staff, academics and students. We're one of very few colleges not to have a chapel, and that's because when the college came by some money early on, there was a debate whether to build a dining hall with the money or a chapel. We have a very fine dining hall and very good food, but still no chapel. We take what we do very seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously, and we're known for being down to earth and supportive, as well as being ambitious and rigorous. Our academics, tutors, students and staff are all one community, and that's driven the way we've managed the many challenges of the last 9-10 months during the pandemic in keeping everyone safe, supporting those for whom the college is their home, making sure that we continue to provide the world-leading education and teaching and support our researchers, and also provide the welfare, mental health and sometimes financial support that our students have needed. Another of the challenges has been how to continue our work, encouraging and supporting young people with the potential to study here, but who don't have access to advice, information, to adults who have any experience of Oxford or our application process. Our outreach work is hugely important to us. And it's even more important at the moment because we know that the disparities in access to educational and teaching inputs from schools and an appropriate and safe place to study at home during the pandemic has worsened the inequality in educational opportunity experienced by young people from different backgrounds all around the country. So I'm hugely grateful that this evening that Janina is not only sharing her expertise and time with us, but she's also asked for us to share a request to you that if you're in a position to do so, to consider contributing to the outreach work that the college does with schools and young people from backgrounds who wouldn't traditionally think of attending Oxford. And I particularly want to highlight to you one of our more recent programmes, which is called Aim for Oxford. And it's a 2-year programme for disadvantaged sixth formers from the northeast of England. It's an area where we've been working with schools as the Link College for many years. It's also the area of England that is most disproportionately unrepresented within Oxford. So we started the programme just over a year ago, and we had 170 applicants of young sixth formers for 40 spaces. Of those we selected, more than half of them were entitled to free school meals, 12% had a care background, and nearly all of them came from families with no previous experience of a university education. The programme involved inputs from our tutors, personal advice sessions from our outreach officer, and culminated with a what should have been a one-week residential in Oxford with all expenses paid. Of course, because of the pandemic, we couldn't bring them here. So instead, we ran what we called a non-residential residential. Of the students that were part of that scheme, 19 of them ended up applying for Oxford. And I'm delighted to say that 7 have now received offers and will be attending the university this autumn. That success rate is higher than from an average cohort, which is fantastic given the kind of backgrounds and schools that these young people came from. Equally as gratifying was the feedback. At the end of the non-residential residential, one of the participants said, "I really enjoyed the lectures where everyone was involved and contributing their ideas, especially the one about research and questions. I also loved the evening activities and seeing the student ambassadors. They were all super approachable, and I really, really enjoyed getting to know them and their experiences at Oxford." The second year of the programme is starting this weekend. We had 208 applicants and 63 have been selected. And this weekend we'll be meeting them online, and I'll be taking the opportunity to speak to their parents as well, to answer any of their questions or concerns about involvement in the programme or considering applying to Oxford. We would love it if you felt that you could help us continue this work this year and for the years to come. And I think sometimes people look at the huge amount of effort that we put into outreach work and wonder about the young people who don't end up with a place at Oxford. We're determined to make sure that everyone who participates in our programmes benefits from them, and has a sense of the widest range of opportunities that are open to them and worlds they might otherwise not have considered, whether in education or elsewhere. And I think it was captured supremely well by a 10-year-old who visited us a few years ago. We had 60 Year 5 students from Oxford Gardens, a school affected by the Grenfell Towers disaster. And a few weeks after that, they came to Oxford for a day and we gave them a range of inputs and a fabulous day out. And one of those Year 5 students was very concerned on the coach on the way to Oxford and told his teacher he'd never been so far from his family. On the coach home, that same young boy turned to his teacher, who asked him how he was at that stage. He paused and thought, and then he said, "You know, I think I could now adventure the world." We want everyone who has contact from St Anne's to see a little bit more and gain a bit more confidence in terms of going out into an adventure within the world. And I know that tonight, Janina, one of our alumna, is going to take us on an adventure in both time and space. Janina studied here at St Anne's, and I'm sure she's going to tell you a little bit more about the impact that that time had on her. We're very proud of her many achievements. She's a well-known writer and presenter, and many of you will have seen the brilliant programmes that she fronts, including Treasures of Anglo-Saxons, Britain's Millennium of the Monasteries, and 2 series of Raiders of the Lost Past. She's also inspiring teacher and course director for the undergraduate certificate and diploma in History of Art here at the University of Oxford. She has also published numerous books, from children's books right through to academic tomes. some of you may be aware, and I mentioned before, that it's just 100 years since Oxford first awarded degrees to women. So tonight, Janina's subject, and this is all new material, she assures me, is why writing women back into the past can change the future. I know we're all desperately keen to hear what Janina has to say, and I'm also delighted that she's agreed to stay this evening to answer questions that are posed to us. So please do use the question and answer box that is part of this Teams function. And we look forward both to what Janina has to say to us and to hearing her response to questions later on. Janina, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Helen. Gosh, that was emotional listening to you talk about all those things. I was with that cohort of students, those year fives that came up that time, and it was a hugely moving experience. These were children dealing with grief, with shock, and we gave them a wonderful day where I hope we opened their minds, but also showed them that my experience of Oxford is exactly as you described because of St Anne's. St Anne's was the warming home that allowed me to find my wings. I didn't know Oxford was for me, and I think if I'd have gone anywhere else with any other tutors and students, I wouldn't have stayed the course. I found parts of it intimidating back in the 90s, but I am so proud to continue to work with you all, and as an alumna, but as a member of the university too, to keep you doing this good work that big swathes of the university are trying to do. We're trying to break down barriers, and I think that's so important. So thank you for those kind words. I've got a presentation which I'm going to bring up for you. As Helen says, this is new material. This is things that I've been experiencing over this year, this remarkable year, 2020. What a time. When I was a young history lover, I fell in love with history age 6, 7, 8. I just knew that the past excited and inspired me. And from that point, I remember thinking, oh, it would be wonderful to go back to some of those really dramatic historic moments and see them, be a part of them, experience them. Well, the truth is we are living through extraordinary times, and it's not as great as I thought it would be as a young enthusiastic history lover. It's been hard for so many of us, and I'm sending so much love and solidarity out to everybody who's tuned in tonight, because these times have been hard. I want to bring you a little bit of escapism tonight, and I want to really make this about looking at a big picture of what we do when we look backwards, because looking backwards helps us understand the present, who we are today, but also where we're going. And we are sat at pivotal times. So the things I'm going to talk about, first of all, I wanted to thank the University and St Anne's for allowing me to speak as part of the 100 years of women in Oxford. Isn't that shocking that it's 100 years that women have been able to get degrees? I find it shocking because when I think about my own lifetime, I've always been aware of my gender. I've always been aware that I am often in male environments, but I've never really felt my sex, in particular being a woman, to hold me back. And when I look at what has been happening in the last year in particular, I can see a more pressing need than ever for us to start reassessing the social inequalities that are all over the world at the moment. And this 100-year celebration is important, partly to recognise the trailblazers that went before, the women that really carved out the paths for me and others, but also to look forward and see what more we could be doing. So I've got 2 quotes here that were they're both very important in relation to the 100 years, but I've highlighted a few statements there that I think are important, that this is about really considering the considerable work that needs to be done going forward. I'll finish this talk with a few statistics, a few shocking problems that we still have to address in terms of inequality. It's a long road, and we have to work out how to achieve racial justice and persisting barriers to full gender equality and higher education for trans women and women of colour. as you'll see throughout this talk, I'm talking about writing women back into the past, but throughout I'm going to be asking you to insert other words. What about if we try and write back people from lower classes into history? What about if we try to write back people, transgender people, people from different races back into history? We're trying to write a new story, but we're looking back to true historical evidence, things that have been written out, and trying to look backwards at injustice to go forwards. There's also an important statement here in the second quote: feminist activism remains vital, especially in these difficult times. So it's with those strong statements that I want to move forward. This is me in happier times, sat overlooking the coast of Crete. Now, I was extraordinarily lucky this year that I did manage to travel to make these programs. I have been part of a team that has put together one of the only internationally filmed history documentary series during 2020, and it has been incredibly hard. I've had to isolate from my family for weeks on end. I've had to stay in hotels where I have paper boxes pushed down the corridor because I'm in quarantine. I've had endless COVID tests. I have been really determined to make this, as have the whole team. And I'm very, very proud of what we've managed to achieve. And this is for the second series, as Helen mentioned, of Raiders of the Lost Past, which will be coming to you in a matter of weeks. I'm nervous and excited, but I'm so proud that we've put this together. And the things that I discovered in making these programs have informed so much else that's been going on in my mind intellectually over the last year. I want to read this quote to you because Helen mentioned that I was going to talk about a little bit about my time at St. Anne's, what it was like. My lasting memory is that my family, Polish, Irish, and my Polish uncle was he had been a victim during the war of a bomb that had killed his entire family. He managed to get over to England and through his own grit and determination got himself a place in Oxford reading history at Balliol, and he was my absolute inspiration. As a tiny girl, I used to look at him and just think, oh, you are amazing, I want to be like you. But it's not easy to get a place in Oxford. I worked incredibly hard, and I all the way through thought it was going to be history at Balliol, history at Balliol, history at Balliol. And eventually I met this new teacher in my sixth form. I was falling out of studying history because the way it was taught to me at school was it was dates, it was facts, it was mostly men, and I couldn't see myself in the things I was reading about. There was a lot of bloodshed, there was a lot of war. I wanted to understand humans from the past, imaginations, cultures, societies. I wanted to get inside the minds of people from the past. And it was when I had a wonderful English teacher join me in the sixth form, Stephanie Boylan, who taught literature to me. She taught me, we did Sylvia Plath, we did Waiting for Godot. And it was through reading those texts, I suddenly thought, this is a subject where I can connect with people from the past through their words, through their imaginations. And so I changed my mind and I applied to do English at St. Anne's, and I was luckily accepted. And thank God it was St. Anne's, because like I say, I don't think I'd have stayed anywhere else. And when I got my place, I asked my uncle, who was very elderly at this point, and his wife, to come and see me at St. Anne's and have tea in my dorm room. And as I mentioned to Helen, our dorms are very modern. St. Anne's is a recent college. It doesn't have turrets. It doesn't have a fancy chapel. And I set up in my tiny room a shoebox with a little tea towel on it, and I served them tea. And when I invited him, he said, which college am I coming to? I said, St. Anne's. He said, oh, the women's college. Now, it wasn't the women's college at this point, it was already co-ed, but that idea that there was still gender distinction, this is the 90s, this is the late 90s, and I automatically at that point bristled, and I've been bristling throughout my career at small moments where I felt injustice between the sexes. And although if you'd have asked me in my 20s, are you a feminist, I'd have probably said no, because I think the feminism I inherited, I saw it as very aggressive. I saw it not really as promoting equality, but division. I wanted to look at all humans from the past equally. I was equally fascinated by all of them. And as the time's gone on, and as I start to feel the issues that we address getting more and more important, I would now say that I do have a feminist approach. The work I'm doing at the moment is focusing on women. And that's just seemed to have happened organically over the last few years. I found this quote, which I think is really interesting for trying to define what feminism does, or at least looking for women. A feminist approach to anything means paying attention to women. It means paying attention when a woman appears as a character and noticing when they do not. It means making some invisible mechanisms visible and pointing out when necessary that while the emperor has no clothes, the empress has no body. It means taking nothing for granted, because the things we take for granted are usually those that were constructed from the most powerful points of view in the culture. And this is not the point of view of women. As I mentioned at the beginning, you could insert other excluded groups in throughout this. It's about power, and power is going to come through a lot in this talk. I have found the work recently that I'm writing 3 books simultaneously, but 2 in particular that I've been researching deeply are work on goddesses, which has taken me across the globe. It has opened my eyes to things that I never knew about. In my 40s, I'm learning from scratch, and it is thoroughly exciting. And the world of goddesses I'm discovering goes back thousands and thousands of years. The image you can see here on the left is the Holofel's, what used to be called Venus figurines. That is a bit of a misnomer now, because of course they have no relationship whatsoever to Venus, the Roman goddess of love. Again, that's a patronym that's been put onto them by the people that discovered them in the 18th and 19th century and were fascinated by them. But there is a glut of this sort of sculpture coming out of the Neolithic period, and what it shows is a fascination with the very creative process of the female body. And the fact that they are so ubiquitous, the fact we find so many of them, suggests that there is this respect, this honouring of the female form and the reproductive process. And then I was looking into cultures like looking at the Hindu religion and seeing these ancient goddesses, Durga and Kali, that go back thousands of years. You can find evidence for Durga beyond the texts that are 3,500, 4,000 years old, beyond that, way back. And these women are so powerful. Durga rides on a lion, and she carries all these wonderful instruments in her hand and defeats this indefatigable demon. And in these women, we can find strength. We can find characteristics that are so recently seen as non-feminine, as things that women simply don't do, but they have been doing them. They've been doing them since the dawn of time, and that's what my research is increasingly telling me. I'm also writing a book. It will be called Femina, and it's reclaiming the medieval women of the past, and through them seeing how the modern attitudes towards women have been really carefully curated across the last few hundred years. So there's women here that you might know. Joan of Arc, still an anomaly for me. I still can't work out how this 16-year-old peasant girl from Orleans was able to lead an army. Elizabeth I, a very complex relationship between strong queens and societies that seem to actually have a negative impact on the role of women. But we know them. We know that they made big, important, big effects on history. But there's others here that you might not know so well. So down at the bottom left, you've got Athelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. I've written a lot about her. I find her fascinating because in a very male world of Anglo-Saxon warriors and halls, she was able to wield the power of a queen, and she has these incredible skill sets. She's a diplomat. She's learned, educated, but she's also fearsome, and was feared by particularly the Vikings that were raiding across the north at that time. So hugely important woman that we don't know enough about. We've got a couple of other faces here. So Zenobia, the Queen of Palmyra, 3rd century. So she launched an invasion which brought Egypt and most of the Eastern Empire under her control. We've got Queen Amina. She's the 16th century ruler from northwest Nigeria, and she led a cavalry of warriors. She was renowned for being an amazing fighter on horseback. I put an image up here of a reconstruction of the Burqa warrior woman who I've spoken about in previous talks, this very important discovery a couple of years ago of a female warrior Viking burial. So a woman equipped with all those weapons that you can see in the reconstruction: a sword, an axe, a quiver of shields, and a horse. This was a huge discovery when the DNA analysis revealed that she was a woman. And honestly, the outcry from parts of the world of media was shocking. The idea that people couldn't believe a woman actually fought. They questioned the very scientific analysis that underpinned this announcement, thought it was nonsense, you know, it couldn't have happened, a woman couldn't have done that. Well, that's partly what I'm here to talk about today. And one of my absolute favourites down there, Hildegard of Bingen, absolute, well, she was a visionary, so but such a polymath. She did everything. She invented a new language. She wrote some of the most beautiful medieval music. She wrote scientific texts, natural history, medicine. She was just extraordinary. And her illuminations that you see in her manuscripts they're so psychedelic. They are visions that she has of the universe and of her place in it. A really important woman who lived just under 1,000 years ago, who really needs reassessing. So those are some of the women from history that have inspired me to look again. And as I started to look for these people, what was remarkable was how many more are waiting to be discovered. It really is a game of detective work. Why is this? Because we know throughout time that across the historical record, for every male, there would have been, on average, a female. And yet these women are not recorded in any percentage like what we get with male men that are recorded across history. And I started to dig deeper and deeper into why this might be. Now, I have been writing about Eve and the Genesis story today. That is one place we could put the division between men and women at the feet off. There is a line that says, you know, that it is Eve that causes original sin, and through that we see certainly the Abrahamic religions building up an attitude where men are superior to women. Adam comes first, Eve comes from his rib. So we could lay the blame there. We could lay the blame at the feet of religion, but that is simply not where most of the blame lies. There are tracts, treaties right the way through the past, certainly 2,000 years, where women are seen as all descendants of Eve, that we're all somehow tainted with sin. But for every one of those, we see extraordinary women that are facilitated, that are supported, raised up, encouraged by male religious people around them. So Hildegard's the prime example. She was the J.K. Rowling of her time, if I can say that in these days, but she was an international superstar writer. She would go and give lectures and people would come and listen to her talk about her books, about her work. And that's because society encouraged her to do that. She could find a place. So for every one woman, there's a social structure around them that supports them, that encourages them. So it's not necessarily straight out of the medieval world that we see this division in gender. It certainly exists. But the real divisions that we still live with today are partly a product of the imperial thrusts of the 18th and 19th century. As you saw men in society going out around the world and imprinting their form of culture onto the people that they met, that also increased a division between the sexes. So here I've got two pre-Raphaelite paintings up, and as much as I love the pre-Raphaelites, and actually as much as the pre-Raphaelite movement really encouraged women as well, there is an underlying narrative in this sort of work, in the sort of Victorian romances, in the Victorian attitudes towards women, where we see the more modern assumptions coming through, that women should be in the house, that they should be domestic. These are perfect representations of that. You've got one woman trapped in a tower embroidering, another quietly embroidering by a window, also trapped. And it's, when I look through the archives, when I look through documents on how women from the past have been rewritten, it's around this time that we start to get manipulations of characters from the past. So we start to see people who pop up in Shakespeare, Ophelia, characters like that being rewritten, Morgan Le Fay, all these quite complex women from the medieval world, being presented as either good or bad, evil or pure. And that is a legacy we're still living with today. So my job as a historian, as somebody interested in cultures of the past, is to move backwards and get as far back to the original evidence as I can, to really hunt for experiences that haven't been filtered through hundreds of years of later commentators. I'm aware I'm going to run hugely over time, but Helen did mention I desperately want to take your questions at the end. So if you don't mind staying a few minutes after, I will hang on and take questions. Just to give you an insight into how remarkable these certain writers, women writers of the past, could be, I've got a couple of quotes here, but I also want to stress that these are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's out there to astound you. These voices that have been written out, literally scrubbed out of archive records, they're there. And I'm trying very hard through looking at all sorts of different disciplines, archaeology, art history, literature, theology, trying to find the evidence for them. But these quotes are fascinating. So one person, Christine de Pizan, who has been in many ways seen as the first feminist writer, she does this wonderful quote from her book, the Book of the City of Ladies, early 15th century. And this shows that these issues we're dealing with today of gender inequality, they were rife in the medieval period, and people were discussing it. It was important for these voices to be heard, and she became hugely popular, well-read and appreciated. And Christine she has a good sense of, she's very witty. She said, should I also tell you whether a woman's nature is clever and quick enough to learn speculative science as well as to discover them, and likewise the manual arts? I assure you that women are equally well suited and skilled to carry them out and to put them to sophisticated use once they have learned them. I couldn't agree more, Christine. Then just below, a quote that I adore by Hildegard of Bingen, one of my favourites. She really does have the quotes down. We cannot live in a world that is not our own, in a world that is interpreted for us by others. An interpreted world is not a home. Part of the terror is to take back our own listening, to use our own voice, to see our own light. I think we should be putting that on banners and t-shirts and pinning it to our computer screens on a daily basis, because this idea of others interpreting the world for us is what's got us to this position now. So looking back to women of the past, we could see that we have had our past curated for us. We have had it manipulated and changed and rewritten to suit each different generation's needs. But we need to take that risk and go back and find our own voice. Now, I promised some revelations, and all of the things I've shown you so far are the research I've been doing to date, things that are constantly in my mind that I'm thinking about working through. But over the last year, I've made this 3-part series, and we went to Knossos in Crete, we went to Oslo in Norway, and we went to Çatalhöyük in Turkey. And you'll see in each of the episodes how much depth we go into, how many extraordinary things each of these programs highlight, both in terms of the archaeologists that found the sites, but also in terms of the cultures that were uncovered, how extraordinary and recent our understanding of them are. But for you today, what I wanted to do was look at each of these places I went to through the lens of women, what they tell us about women of the past. So I'm starting off here with Knossos, and it was discovered first in 1878 by Minos Kalakarinos. He was from Crete, but his name very rarely gets remembered because it was Arthur Evans, who actually had a lot to do with getting the Ashmoleans collection together. He was curator of the Ashmolean, who in 1900 fully excavated the site. There's a whole story here about colonialism in archaeology as well, which the program's going to look at in some more depth. But Arthur was a fascinating man and a dreamer when it came to the past, as I think a lot of archaeologists and a lot of historians have to be. There's a good degree of imaginative work that goes on when you think your way back into the past. That can sometimes lead you down blind alleys, but the more you research, the more you found your imaginative world on things you know, that facts and information that you can prove, the better. And he was working from ground zero, really. He didn't know what he was going to discover. And what he discovered was an entirely new civilization that he had to name. Imagine that, finding a civilization that you get to name. And he decided to name it after the legendary king of Crete, King Minos. So they're known as the Minoans. But what I found so interesting is when Arthur first broke ground and started to bring up this city, this complex at Knossos, he was having to work things out as he went along, having to make sense of something that eyes hadn't seen for thousands of years. The first palace dates back to 2000 BC, but there's evidence that people had lived on this site for many thousands of years before that. So it may well have had significance, religious significance or social significance before that. And at its peak, it's around 1700 BC, this site had a population of 100,000 people. That is big. That is big. And by looking at it in its fully excavated form, we can start to see a bit more about how this society functioned. You can see down there a photograph of the site as it is now. One of the things that was levelled against Arthur Evans, and I think this is relevant to the whole talk, is he was a man excavating through the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s, and a lot of this reconstruction work that he did was going from the 20s into the 30s. He was a man of his time. And when he rebuilt parts of Knossos, he was doing it from his own tastes, his contemporary tastes and interests. So some say it's more Art Deco than it is Minoan in its reconstruction, and it's been sort of called a bit of a Disneyland-ification, if that's a word, for archaeological sites, how to sort of turn an archaeological site into a tourist trap. But in terms of his digs, they were well excavated, well documented, and throwing up constant revelations. Now, we know from finds from Minoan Crete how creative and wonderful they were. These are, again, about 3,500, 4,000 years old, these pots, but they are beautiful. I had a go at making one of these, and I used the original brushes to try and get these reeds that move with the shape of the vessel. It's really hard. You have to do these sorts of sweeps with the brush and create this effect that is so modern. It looks like reeds swaying in the wind, and it was created thousands of years ago. And here you see this fascination with the sea. Of course, Crete is an island surrounded on all sides by beautiful blue sea, and their respect for the natural world comes through in all their arts. Their art is, again, really fitted with the tastes of the 1920s and 30s. There's beautiful birds and creatures and animals and mythical creatures like griffins throughout. So they had this sort of wonderfully empathetic relationship with nature, it seems. But other things started coming out of the ground as Evans was excavating, and these in particular, I think, started to enhance his reputation, because what he'd set about finding was the palace of Minos. And if you know the story from the later Greek legends, Minos has his own father is Zeus in bull form. His wife Pasiphae falls in love with a bull, a beautiful white bull apparently, and together they give birth to a creature that becomes known as the Minotaur. And this creature terrifies Minos, so he builds a labyrinth underneath his palace to conceal it. And this is what Evans wanted to find. He wanted to, like Troy had there's a discovery of Troy, there's discovery of these ancient sites. He wanted to find the palace of Minos and the labyrinth. And when these incredible complex of corridors started to come out of the ground, his first reaction was, we've done it, we found it. Then he found things like this. This is, oh, it's beautiful. It's huge, this bull's head. And it's actually meant for pouring wine. So the wine comes out of the bull's nose. But it's so stunningly made. Beautiful glass eyes that sort of glint and move when you look at it in the light. Really stunning object. And then there were these wall paintings that kept appearing. Not just wall paintings, sculptures too, of men leaping over bulls. So Evans and others since have suggested that in Minoan culture there must have been this sort of bull leaping competition, a little bit like bullfighting today. You know, the man takes on the beast, but it's clearly some sort of athletic exercise. It's virtually impossible. So is this something fantastical? Is this something that they're imagining only the finest humans can do? Or did they actually partake in some sort of deadly ritual like this where they try and leap over a bull? It really was reinforcing for him that he'd found Minos, he'd found this strong civilization of the past with a king, with strong heroes, and it all fitted with the classical pattern of the past. Then we see problems. Even in this last example I can show you, there's fragments there where you can see the sort of 3D bits coming out. That's what he found. And he had to piece these things together like jigsaws that are missing more than half their pieces. So there's an awful lot of interpretation and free-for-all going on with some of these images. And this is one of the most iconic images from Knossos. Indeed, it appears on all the branding that he was sending out at this time. This was the Prince of Knossos. This was supposed to be this huge life-size wall, in relief wall painting of a king, a prince. He's strong, he's got these muscles, he's got this plume that looks like a crown. Brilliant. Evans had found evidence for his male hierarchical society with kings and princes at the head of it. But later reconstruction work on this has revealed it's not a single piece at all. He'd found all these fragments on the ground that had been muddled up together. And what he's actually done is put 3 different sculptures together with his own imagination. And those 3 images, you can see in the image, the photo I've taken on the right, if you look at it from the side, the arm and the chest are in relief. They're coming out, they're built up with plaster. And that is the arm and chest of one boxer. And the leg pointing in the other direction is the leg of a second boxer. Because there's also found further images of boxing, men engaged in the art of boxing. So it's 2 separate bodies that he's put together in this rather awkward reverse pattern where one arm faces one way and the leg faces the other way. The headdress was in fact from a griffin, another image altogether. So he's put this together because he was looking for a powerful male leader from the past. This started to unravel a bit when he got to one of the most important chambers in the complex, which is the throne room. And you can see here, still survives this stone chair in the middle of a set of benches, right in the heart of the complex. And it looks very much like a throne, doesn't it? It looks like a typical image of power, parliament, or, you know, the Queen's court. It's one person is important and the others sit subservient around the edges. But what he found when he looked again at the seat was that the shape of it, believe it or not, this has been archaeologically proven, the shape of the carving for the buttocks to sit in on this throne could only fit a small female pair. And so it's not necessarily a man's throne. It's much more likely that the person that sat here was a woman. And if it is a woman, are they a queen? Are we thinking about traditional power structures, power pyramids that we're used to from more modern times? Or is this something ritual? Is this where a goddess is worshipped? Is this something that brings the community together? As the site unfurls and unfurls, the picture becomes more and more complicated, because what you start to see as you look across the different buildings that were functioning at Knossos is not a palace like we'd think of it. It's not like Buckingham Palace or Hampton Court Palace. It's not really a royal residence at all. Some of the rooms have been named the King's Room, the Queen's Room, but they don't seem to be serving that function. What else seems to be going on here is much more like an administrative hub for a society. You've got libraries, collections of tablets are kept here, so catalogues, archives. You've got storerooms to store the oil in particular that the Minoans exported. Corridors and corridors of these huge pithoi that were the sort of trading centre for the Minoans. You've got offices, small offices, administrative offices where you can imagine, you know, these pithoi are being counted out. And certainly what seems to be a religious quarter that's directed towards the sun, that seems to have areas for procession, but not necessarily for royal people, but maybe for some sort of worship, religious practice. So the place becomes much more complicated, and we can start to sort of write King Minos out of the story a little bit and write some other people in. And what's interesting is the people we seem to be able to write in are predominantly women, or these are just a section of the wall paintings that come up throughout Knossos. There are images of men, but where they're shown, they're either in sporting poses, boxing or bull leaping, or they're serving women. So these are women involved in a procession, probably a religious procession. These are women at leisure. They are sat under a tree, they're talking, and you see other women coming towards them. There's not a male head in sight. This entire wall is covered with women's heads. Again, this is another set of fragments. Look at the top section there, where there's these sort of abbreviated black outlined women's heads, and you can tell they're female heads because of the way their hair has been styled. And these women are in luxurious clothes. They're feasting, they're sitting, they're relaxing. And then some of the bigger wall frescoes are, again, all of these wonderfully glamorous women. Now, I'm not saying by any stretch that this is a egalitarian or equal society. These women are no doubt high status. They're no doubt rich, which in their own way makes them an elite of their own. But what I find extraordinary is how ubiquitous the images of women are. And this one is one of my favourites, this little one here. It's called La Parisienne. That's what Evans called it. And it became an absolute hit in the 20s because she was seen to represent sort of fashionable lady of Paris with her red lipstick and her beautiful hairstyle. But again, for me, when you see the whole collection in the Heraclean Museum, when you walk past them, it is just this omnipresence of the female face, the female form, that strikes me. And then Evans started to change his views as the more he excavated for 35 years. And over that time, he realized that maybe what he said at first was wrong, and he wanted to rebuild his view of this society, partly because he kept finding figurines like these as well. These are known traditionally as Minoan snake goddesses. Are they goddesses? We will never know, because it doesn't come with a handy caption to tell us exactly, how it was interpreted. But there's indicators here. You've got the panther sat on the head, and these two snakes that she's holding in either hands. Now, snakes are traditionally chthonic. They're about resurrection because they slough their skin. They're about resurrection from the dead. And this idea of subduing nature is certainly at play with this woman. She's got a very iconic looking face, and the way that she's depicted is powerful and strong. So with all that evidence coming out of the visual arts, it might be possible to reconstruct an early religious framework in Minoan Crete that seemed to worship a goddess. There are these things. So this is it's known as the Los Minos ring. Again, the names stick. It's a bit like with Venus figurines, that once you call it Minos, Minos's palace, Minos's ring, everything's taken back to him. But that's just the name that was given to it when it was discovered. What it actually shows, it's one of these seal stones. There's hundreds of them. They're beautiful, they're tiny, and they're usually jewels that have been carved out. So when you imprint them in wax, they make this reverse impression. And here you've got what seems to be phases of worship. You've got 3 temples represented and these trees emerging out of them. And there's 3 women, one to the left, one to the right, and then one pushing this boat that also has miniature representations of temples on them. And then right up in the corner above the left-hand woman is another little woman with wings. So we don't know exactly what it is. We don't know exactly how to interpret this, but one interpretation is that it's the phases of apotheosis, the phases of the death and regeneration of a goddess, that we could perhaps be looking at the soul entering the goddess. We could perhaps be looking at her relationship to nature, where she hangs there from the tree, and then as she moves across the waters, is that a passage to the afterlife? We don't know. It does show us a lot of things, though. It shows us that women are right at the centre of this society, and it also shows us the importance of the sea, of the fact that Crete was it seems relatively peaceful trading society all these thousands of years earlier. So just to wind up my creeps, I found going to Knossos the most extraordinary experience because I was overwhelmed by the sophistication of this society. We know that the Minoans were wiped out by a couple of terrible instances. Firstly, in 1600 BC, there was the Santorini explosion, the explosion of a volcano, which caused a tsunami that spread through the Aegean Sea and devastated the coastal settlements all the way around Crete. So it's interesting, if you walk along the beach still, there's layers of Minoan pottery just churned up and thrown up, and that's what the tsunami did 3,400 years ago. Then just after that, in about 1400 BC, the Mycenaeans attacked. And again, you can see evidence of burning of buildings, burning of temples. They replaced what seems to be a sort of form of goddess worship with a male god, with a form of Zeus. And then the story of Crete ties itself much more to the story of the Mycenaeans and mainland Greece. But that window, that moment where Knossos was thriving, for me, was just a beautiful window of the past, a time that it's, as I say, it's not an equal society, but I just love seeing women, because often you just can't even see them represented visually or iconographically throughout cultures. And that brings me on, I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to try and do this one quickly. But the other big surprise for me was going into Viking culture. Now, I have said for a long time that there is an attitude towards women in the Viking world that's very different to that in mainland Europe during the early medieval period. I think, I know that I'm going to be talking about this a bit more with Helen, but this image here by Frank Dixie from it's from 1880, I think it is, about then. And it's the funeral of a Viking. And this is, I think, the image of Vikings that we've inherited today. You can see them there, horned helmets on the one at the front, all the elements fighting with one another, the storm, the water, the fire. It's very elemental and very raw, and they are controlling this ship. They are powerful men, and this ties, I think, closely into the Victorian ideal of conquest as well. The idea that the Vikings were wonderful role models because they went out and conquered the world with their raw strength and their tenacity. This is what I think a lot of people still think about when they envisage the Viking world. And the ships that have come out, there's only been a handful. I was lucky enough to be on the Jallenstad dig as it was happening last year, the fourth Viking ship to come out of the ground in Norway. It's extraordinary, and it's rewriting our understanding yet again. But this was the first, and this is the Gokstad ship. And it was found in 1880. It was it's a typical seafaring Viking ship, but it's enormous. The photos don't do it justice. It's huge. To be in the presence of this thing is to be utterly overwhelmed. And when this was found, it seemed to tie into Dixie's Victorian vision of the Vikings. Inside, there was the body, a skeleton of a man, and he was, here we go, he was 40 to 50 years old, of powerful build, and between 180 and 183 centimeters tall. So he's a big, strong Viking man. Big surprise. Everything that accompanied him fitted in with this narrative. You had 12 horses, 6 dogs, a peacock, all arranged around the man's body, and him and his ship were buried in the ground. So far, no surprises. However, when a few 20 years later, discoveries of parts of this ship started to come out of the ground in Norway, things seemed a bit different. So in 1904, Gabriel Gustafsson found this ship in Oseberg, and it's known as the Oseberg ship. It is beautiful. If you can see the carvings there on the prow, that interlacing of beasts is known as Oseberg style after this ship. It became so important that it was on the banknotes that were coming out of a newly independent Norway. It became a banner. The discovery of this really, in many ways, enhanced the Norwegian fight for independence from Sweden, which was to come in just a year later. Now, it's 9th century, 22 meters long, and the mast would have been 10 meters high. It's huge. It's got oar holes for 30 people. And everything about it screams wealth, magnificence. It's one thing to own a ship like this, which, to be honest, is a millionaire's yacht of the early medieval period. But to bury it in the ground, that is a real sign of power and authority. They had this ship buried. And what's so remarkable is when it first appeared, everyone said, right, Vikings, ships, exploration, brilliant. But 2 skeletons were found inside this ship, and they were both women. And that they were the ones that seemed to be honoured by this ship burial. So the first woman was probably around the age of 80. We know from her bones that she suffered from a number of maladies, including arthritis. But the second one was aged between 50 and 55. At first, people thought that this was maybe a queen being buried with a sacrificed servant, that someone young has been buried with them. But actually, later analysis has shown that these women were both of high status. The younger one, who everyone thought was the sacrificial victim, she'd been picking her teeth, which is a luxury, again, a luxury item, a toothpick. And she too doesn't seem to have been sacrificed. Initially, they thought that there was a broken collarbone, which showed that maybe she'd been killed and placed in the earth. But when we've looked again at the bones, that's actually healed before she died. So she doesn't seem to have been sacrificed at all. So we don't know exactly what the relationship is between these women. We don't know who they were. We can speculate because of where the site was. There's a few contenders for who they could be. But what I think is so extraordinary is that women are honoured in this way. And these are their bones here. You can see the 2 women together. This is a reconstruction of what they may have looked at. So they both had really luxurious clothing on. One had a very fine red wool dress with a lozenge twill pattern and a fine linen veil. And the other wore a paler woolen dress, blue, dyed blue, with a veil. And so maybe one is slightly wealthier than the other, but they're both being laid out in honour. And what is so staggering is the array of grave goods that went into the ground with these women. It's the world of the Vikings encapsulated in a ship. And it's not, surprisingly, all axes and, dare I say, horned helmets, which the Vikings never wore. It's everything else that the Vikings needed in this life and in the afterlife. Cauldrons, spoons, plates. This thing in the centre is a rattle, which probably would have been shaken during the funerary procession to make a dramatic noise. You've got beds, you've got armchairs. All of the things on the right-hand side are weaving and spinning equipment, including actual looms of wool that have survived in the waterlogged conditions. You've got an entire cart, a huge proper functioning cart that has been preserved, covered all over with these stories from Norse mythology of Freya with the cats pulling her chariot. Then you've got sleighs. There's a number of sleighs found in the Osberg ship. I love the idea of seeing these sleighs going over the Viking landscape, and boots, clothes, the things people really wore, the things they held in their hands, the things they used on a day-to-day basis. They all survive in this collection, and they're all interred in the ground in honour of these 2 women. So that told me quite a lot. I know I've got to stop, and so I won't go into any detail, but with every discovery I'm making as I move through my academic life, I get more excited, but I also start to draw more points of communication, and I also see the things that correlate across time and across space. So this site, Çatalhöyük, is the last of the programs, and it is Neolithic. It goes back over 14,000 years, and it's the very first city. And what I found so extraordinary, and I don't want to give too much away, but in these houses, there is virtually no stratification or hierarchy of structure. There doesn't seem to be religious buildings, there doesn't seem to be palace buildings, there doesn't seem to be anything other than people living alongside each other. And in terms of gender, it's really powerful because the skeletons that came up don't show any differentiation in terms of what they did in their lives. Men and women did exactly the same jobs. Men and women ate exactly the same things. And this, for me, we're still finding out about it, but I love the idea that 14,000 years ago, society had this sort of equality, this idea that people lived, and for thousands of years they lived in this way alongside one another, helping each other and in a community, but balanced community. So a little bit of ideology there to go forward. I thought I wanted to wind up by going back to my title, which is How Women from the Past Can Help Shape the Future. This is the present we live in, and I have shared these before, but I find them shocking. There are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs altogether. It will take 108 years to close the gender gap. Only 6 countries give women equal legal rights to work as men. And it goes on. Women earn on average 9% less than men. 1 in 3 women are sexually abused at some point in their life. Each minute, 28 girls are married before they're ready. These are shocking statistics, and they're happening now. There's I suppose, a sense for some of us growing up in the West in the last 30, 40 years that we've done well, we've got where we needed to go. I remember starting a seminar when I used to lecture in York University with a group of students where I said, right, today we're doing feminist art history. And a girl turned to me and she said, oh, feminism? I don't want to know about feminism. That's so old. We don't need feminism anymore. And I remember thinking, wow, well, this is going to be a good session. But I think that these things are showing us we do still need to be fighting injustice, and we need to be searching for equality. In terms of the way that the past can help shape the future, I think our relationship with the past, we need to be teaching history, teaching the humanities, equally alongside the STEM subjects in schools, because it's only by understanding where we come from that we know where we're going. In a way, coming to terms with our past as communities, as maybe as individuals through family trees, or certainly through as nations, looking backwards, acknowledging what's happened to us and been brought about because of us, can help us to move forward. So I've put their historical study as therapy, but I certainly think that there is a responsibility for all of us to look backwards and make sense of the past, but to make sense of it in a truthful way. And that's the job I want to do. I'm going to keep searching. I'm going to keep studying archives, looking for evidence, and trying to get back to a sense of the past that hasn't been curated for me. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you all so much for listening to me. How do I stop sharing? There we are.
Janina, that was absolutely amazing. You really have taken us on quite a few adventures through the centuries and around the world. We had some questions submitted in advance, and we've had a load of questions and really interesting points made in the Q&A on this. So I've got the unenviable task of trying to pull some of those out and give you an opportunity to answer them. So I'll ask you some of the specific questions. There are some that are similar that I'll try and group. And I hope we'll accept my apologies if we don't manage to cover everything. But I thought maybe we could start off with quite a specific one, which came in advance, where the question was posed: do you think fishing societies like Iceland and Netherlands are the most feminist because men have traditionally been away most of the time?
It's a great question. So I work a lot with the Viking world. I've written about them in children's books, and actually in the exercise of writing fiction set in the Viking period, it helped me to think my way into the society in a sort of real nuts and bolts way. You know, what did people wear? What did they eat? What did they use to brush their teeth? You know, and in studying it both academically and in this sort of imaginative way, I think there's a real danger that we impose ourselves back on the past too heavily, that we think ourselves back into these positions and bring our modern preconceptions and our modern worlds with us. My feeling in terms of looking at the archaeological evidence is that there is certainly there is an argument that could be made that while the men go a Viking, which they do for a good 5-6 months of the year, and that will be a large portion of the male population that do that. It is the absolute necessity for Scandinavian cultures, because the winters are so hard, that while the seas are passable, while the men can actually go, they can travel, they can trade, they can raid and take things too, but they bring back what's needed for a hard winter. Because it gets very hard, particularly in some of those northern reaches of Norway and Sweden. It's you can't farm, you can't take anything from the land. So we know that the men are doing this, going a Viking, they're going out on their ships. And absolutely in their absence, it's the women that run the society. And we know that from reports of the sort of social structure, you know, representation in terms of meeting together for the Althing, for meetings, but also from finds like keys. We find lots and lots of women buried with big sets of keys, and the keys are the keys to things like the chests that held the wealth of the farm or the community. So being buried with those keys was a sign of that responsibility, that the women had that responsibility. But there is, and I'd say this again, and I should have been emphasizing this all the way through. I can look at the past in my way, and it will be different to how someone else looks at it. And you can take evidence and manipulate it into your own narrative if you want to. I try to be objective, and with things like keys, with things like just the way that women are treated in burial, the law codes that survive, overwhelmingly, there is a sense that women in the Viking world had many, many more rights than their equivalents in other parts of the world. So essentially, yes, is the answer.
Thanks. We've had a brilliant question from Faith, who says, as a Viking reenactor, and just what an amazing thing that must be to be. So as a Viking reenactor, Faith portrays a female warrior, but she's restricted to doing this when reenacting battles during the pagan period of Viking history. And she goes on, and I think she's kind of drawing the point. In effect, did Christianity make women, limit women's options to being the housewife, you know, at home, and stop them from being able to fight and go into these what we now see as more male roles?
It is a really tricky subject because we have so little surviving that we know of. Now, what the discovery of the Burka warrior woman taught us was traditionally, when you open up a grave, there are some indicators of sex from the bones, so hip bones, for example, but if the skeletons aren't complete, most archaeologists will determine whether it's a man or a woman in a grave on the basis of what they're buried with. So if they're buried with beads and brooches, it's a woman. If they're buried with a sword or a knife, it's a man. And this has happened. I mean, archaeology is such a new subject. It's only really been in the last century that real archaeology, as we know it today, has taken place. Otherwise, it was smash and grab and take the treasures out and cover it back up. But what we need to now do is reassess, go back, have a look with DNA analysis at other so-called warrior burials and see if the bones could be female. And I would hazard a guess that we will find many more. But I think that this is true, that Christianity transformed Scandinavia slowly and gradually, but certainly in a way that was not helpful towards women. And lots of the traditions carry on. So if you read Laxdæla Saga, which is much later, in that the woman is still very much the sort of vengeful, powerful woman of the pagan past, but she becomes a nun, so she's Christianized, she's cast in a new guise, and that we see that happening all the time. And again, that's one of the challenges of looking backwards across time, is seeing which culture at any one time has impacted the representation of women and why. So it's a hard job, and I think Christianity, I mentioned Eve, I mentioned, you know, descendants of Eve. There's a lot of problems that come in with theological approaches to women that are manifest in social difference. You know, the fact that women can't divorce, the fact that women have less legal rights than men, and that runs right the way through the modern period for, you know, certainly the last 1,000 years. I think she's right that, you know, in terms of accuracy, we don't know if women still carried on in their warrior roles after Christianity arrived. But I want to find the grave that proves it wrong. I always want to find the evidence that could somehow prove it wrong. Yeah.
So while we're talking about Christianity, we've had a couple of questions about Julian of Norwich, who I know you've written a fantastic book about. One asking, what can she teach us about our contemporary world? And the other one, Veronica, puts the position that she believes that Julian was a feminist writer. And would you support that?
Oh, I love questions about Julian. Julian has such a place in my heart, because I was writing that book as Brexit was happening, as Trump was being brought in, and things were starting to change. And I had read Julian when I was an undergrad at St Anne's. But I hadn't really returned to that text for many years. And I went back into Revelations of Divine Love, and I was blown away by what I read. I couldn't really believe what I was reading. I've spent the last 2 decades reading medieval texts, and Revelations of Divine Love is unlike anything else. And I think was it Veronica who asked about the feminism aspect? In response to that, I would say, again, feminism is a modern term. It's only really been around for a matter of decades. So can we impose our modern view of what a feminist is backwards? What I think Julian was someone very aware of her sex as a woman. The idea that she was a woman who was trying to understand a spiritual depth that was often restricted to women. And I, again, want to rehabilitate the words nun and anchoress, because we have modern notions of what those things are. A nun is someone quiet who sits and prays all day and might have a ginger cat to keep her company. But medieval nuns were not that at all. They were the movers, the shakers, the intellectuals. They were the academics. They were choosing a life of enclosure, choosing a life away from being a mother, having to run a household, in order to learn, to think, to expand their horizons, expand their minds. So the nuns are some of the most interesting people in the medieval period. And Julian, I think, really was extraordinary. And remind me what the first part of the question was about her relevance, was it?
Yeah, about what can she teach us about the contemporary world?
Oh, well, I think what she can teach us is that we're very, very similar across time, aren't we? In times of absolute disaster that she was living through. She was living in the wake of the Black Death. She probably lost she almost certainly lost family members to the subsequent wakes of plague. She witnessed the 100 Years' War unfolding. She was living during the schism where there were 2 popes, so you didn't even know who the head of the church was, and she was surrounded by people being burnt and accused of heresy. So Julian looked out of her small window and saw death, destruction, neighbours turning on neighbours, family turning on family. And in that, she wrote this beautiful, optimistic, hopeful view of existence where people are good and love is the most important thing and all shall be well. I just think she was extraordinary. And for me, the most important thing she tells me about 14th century England and 14th century Norwich, but she tells me what it is to be human through time. And that's the power of art, of writing, of making something and leaving it. It captures not a date or a moment necessarily, but it captures an intellectual flowering. And you can get back to those people by studying it. You can get back to them by reading their words and looking at their artworks.
Sounds like she would be very fitting those themes for the world we're living in now.
Absolutely.
We've had a lot of questions about kind of how can we put history right? How can we rebalance history? And maybe if we can start with how do we find these lost women? What are the barriers to getting them put back into the historical narrative?
It's such a good question, and it's the one that I'm grappling with at the moment. Sadly, so much has been destroyed. So, I mean, I think, when we talk about iconoclasm, when we talk about the destruction of the past, and certainly, here in Britain, we might think about the Reformation and the smashing up of sculptures. What there was in terms of women from the past was a steady, slow degradation of the role of women, which meant that if an image or a text was deemed in any way not fitting within that current society, it would be written out, burnt, removed, it would be destroyed. So much has been lost. So much has been lost. There are fortunate survivors like Julian's text, which was sort of hidden by monastic communities for centuries and came to life. And I think archaeology is a place of great potential, because it is stuff that is coming out of the earth that hasn't been meddled with, hasn't been edited, hasn't been filtered. And archive work is really important. So going back, particularly into private collections, things that we don't necessarily know on the public sphere. The internet's making that easier to go and request things that must exist. They must be somewhere in this monastery or in that private house collection. But it is detective work. And again, there's a danger for me as an academic. I want to have the full picture. I want to have as much evidence at my fingertips as I possibly can. But that's sometimes not the case. And so the ones we know more about, your Marjorie Kemps, your Hildegard of Bingen, they've become a focal point for what must have been a much broader intellectual scene than we can reconstruct with the evidence today. So it can be done, but it's not ever going to be done completely, because too much destruction has taken place along the way.
And questions as well about obviously prominent women who we've lost or we don't know the full story about, but also understanding the lives of ordinary women from different eras. Are there the different challenges in relation to that perspective?
Absolutely, and this goes for women and men, and this is another part of my research that matters to me a lot. You know, it's all fair and well to talk about kings and queens and women buried in boats, but what about everyone else? Where am I? Where are we? You know, the people who won't be buried in a boat when they die. It's really hard, and it's hard regardless of gender. But again, it's largely useful to look at archives, so you can get law codes. A lot of people find legal documents really boring, but I think they're fascinating. It's where normal people have to defend themselves or defend their property or defend their existence, if you like, and they leave these records behind. So we can get to them, but it's much harder. And also materially, in terms of material culture, they would have had less high status stuff. And what's interesting, I held a crucifix in the British Museum that isn't even on display. It's one of the rarest things, and yet almost every single house in 14th century England would have had one. And it's just a regular run-of-the-mill wooden crucifix with an image of Christ carved on it. Quite rough, quite ready. The fact that there were thousands of them and only one survives is because it wasn't deemed worthy of saving. It was the thing that everybody had, and so we lose it. And that's so true in the material record. You'll get the exceptional that survives, and from that you've got to make assumptions, but the really day-to-day used things are the stuff that get thrown out, end up in dustbins, don't get treasured, don't end up in a museum. So it's really hard. Again, it's doable, and there's some lovely stories that I'm going to be telling in my Feminar book about women I've discovered of that are less high status, and they bring the world to life, but it's not easy.
Louise has asked a kind of Oxford-related question, which is,
okay.
How important do you think it is that Oxford has just very recently announced its first Hillary Rodham Clinton Professor of Women's History, and that's Professor Banjari Stevenson. What difference do you think that's going to make?
I think it's fabulous for a start. I think when I was at university, to begin with, there was a branch of academia that had been bubbling away from the sort of 70s, which was known as women's studies. And I remember just the disrespect with which I saw colleagues in other departments treating their colleagues in women's studies, that it was somehow, far too exclusive, far too niche, and really not worth pursuing at all. And I think we've realised that simply is not the case, that we desperately still need scholars working in these fields. I think that Oxford is trying really hard with its inclusion on many levels, and actively trying to do that from grassroots things like going on the outreach programs that St Anne's is doing, all the way up through undergraduate courses, transforming their curricula and being more inclusive in their curricula, all the way up to the top, where the appointment of senior professors, senior academics and lecturers are being put in place to change the landscape of the university, but even more broadly, change the landscape of knowledge and scholarship across the world. It's so slow. And I'm so frustrated by the pace of progress. It feels like we shouldn't still be here, but I think that it's a step in the right direction. And I think it's part of a much bigger programme that Oxford are trying to do that fills me with some hope.
Thank you. I'll shortly come on to what will probably be the last question, but there have been a couple of things that I know people would want us to check up with you. One, we know that you were quite poorly with COVID. So a few people saying, are you better now, Janina? You seem to be full of energy, but I know you have all your work, you've had all your travel, you're probably doing some homeschooling with your kids as well. So yeah, we all hope that you are fully recovered.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you to everybody. And yes, I am. I'm 100% health-wise. It was a really horrible thing to experience, and it gave me the shock right at the start of the pandemic about taking it deadly seriously and really understanding the need to do all the things we're being told, wear masks, self-isolate and socially distance, because you don't want to get it. It's horrible. So thank you. And I've been so grateful. Everyone's been so kind to me across the last few months of asking, are you okay? So thank you, everyone. I am, yes. And the homeschooling is going fine this time round. The children are being very good.
Well, I would say I think your children are more fortunate than most. I think both I and my kids are very glad that they're beyond that stage. Otherwise, that wouldn't have been very successful. And the other question that I'm sure everyone's wanting to know the answer to is, when is the Raiders of the Lost Past going to be broadcast, and when is your next book coming out?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's going out on BBC Two this time because it hits such huge audiences worldwide last time, so that's exciting. And I think it's scheduled for the end of February, so it's quite soon. We're about to wind up the edits and do the voiceover record, so it's poised and ready to go. And I think the BBC will be trailing it, so my little face will be popping up in your living rooms, I'm afraid to say, but I think you're going to love it. It's just, for me, it's the pleasure of discovery. I think that the reason I'm so glad I went to St Anne's is because I am such a curious soul, and I needed somewhere where I could foster that curiosity, and it's never left me. I'm still a magpie about knowledge, but I absolutely love learning still, and so I think the programme is again, you could see me learning on the job basically. And the other thing, the books, so I've got one on 1066 which is coming out imminently. I'm just winding that one up. Goddesses will be next year, I think, and Femina I'm working on throughout this year as well, but they're all, my fingers haven't stopped. The steam coming off my fingertips as I'm frantically writing, so trying to keep all the balls in the air. So it's a strange time, but keeping busy helps, I think.
That's fantastic to know, and gives us all a lot to look forward to in these somewhat rather grey times. So the last kind of question with content I'd like to put to you really is bringing us up to date. And I guess we look backwards and say so many ordinary and extraordinary women have been lost or hidden within our history. What can we be doing today to make sure that the history of the future that's happening now, women, both prominent and ordinary women, have their rightful place in the history that's being written now?
Now, there's an optimistic and a pessimistic answer to this. I'll start with the pessimistic one, which is, if I've learned anything from my work with looking at the past, it's that civilizations rise and fall, that ideologies come and go, and as we feel like we're reaching a pinnacle of knowledge, of discovery, think of the Greeks, think of the Egyptians, it can turn on a pin, and like with the Minoans, tsunami, something like that can affect it and set us all back. But the optimistic answer is that we've lived through something that no other humans have ever lived before, which is the digital revolution, which has also led to international communication on a scale that we've never seen before. And through that, I think what we have here is a chance to forge lasting ideals that we would want to see across the world. And certain parts of the world are hugely lucky in the fact that they've made advancements in those areas already. We are now coming to you from Oxford. We are in England, a place that has for a while argued for equal rights on many platforms. That's not the case in vast parts of the world, as I showed with those statistics. So our understanding of where we are ideologically is at odds with many other people around the world. And we are at an impasse, I think, as well, even in the West, by seeing the tensions that are growing up between right and left, insults being hurled in both directions. And like a pendulum, it can swing either way. We could find ourselves in a world where suddenly women don't have equal rights again, and there is more power structure, more dictatorship and power structures in place. But I like to think that Pandora's box has been opened, and once you open the box and you say, hey, why don't we pay attention to people of different races, people of different genders, people of different backgrounds, that you can't put it back in the box. That's my hope. And in terms of what we can do, we can't do anything. We are part of the sands of time. We could try and document, we could try and celebrate in art, we could put up sculptures, we could make paintings of people that we admire, we can write their stories, we can try and get as much documentation down about them as we physically can. But whether that survives or not is down to chance a lot of the time. And that's the sad truth. I would love to know about all the great people that have gone before, but I will never know about them. I will know only a handful of them. But that's enough to keep me going for the time being. And what I would say as well is I am a lecturer, I'm a teacher. It matters to me that what I do carries on, and what every one of us academics hope is that you sow a seed and other people do, it grows because of other people's work. So I'd love you to share discoveries that you make of your own records, your own archives, what's down the road from you. Academics can't get to all of that information, but we can share it in a way we've never been able to share it before. So that's exciting, and that gives me a lot of hope as well.
Janina, that is absolutely fantastic. You have been so kind and generous to give us so much of your time and your thoughts and your energy, and an absolutely fascinating presentation. There are quite a number of questions that I'm sorry we haven't got to. Janina might be able to jot down a few notes in response to all of them, but I would encourage, encourage everyone to look at the questions and do some research and thinking for yourselves.
But also, if you want to contact me on Twitter or on Facebook, or if you want to get in touch and you really want your question answered, I would love to answer them. So please do keep the conversation going. Stay in touch with me.
Yeah, well, we will be publishing a link to this recording in the coming days, and into anything else that Janina can share with us to share with you. It's been wonderful to have you with us this evening. I'm sure you've got plenty of food for thought. I hope you also take some of Janina's energy and optimism for the future. As a college, our aspiration is to understand the world and change it for the better. Janina Ramirez is an absolute inspiration in that regard, and just want to encourage everyone, whatever your area of interest is, whatever area of the world you're in, to take that goal. And if we can all just change the world a little bit for the better, then we're making some progress at least. But thank you, Janina. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope that we will all be able to meet again face to face at St Anne's College or elsewhere in the not too distant future. Until then, please stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.